Um, Good morning, everybody. We're continuing on the somewhat from the previous panel, talking about sort of geostrategic issues, political issues. We're going to talk about the Indo Pacific strategy, and we're very lucky to have with us my former Foreign Service colleague, Walter Douglas, who is now Deputy Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs and Public Policy in the East Asian Pacific Bureau. He and I go back to Korea days, right? Yeah, early 90s. We all saw he was going to be a great officer at that time, so yeah. But let's get right into the topic. When I saw that this was the topic we were given, it seemed to me that essentially it's another way of framing the subject of what is the Trump administration Asia policy, because Indo-Pacific policy is simply the name that the Trump administration has given its policy for this part of the world. Now we also heard Secretary Mattis in Honolulu on May 30th rename the Pacific Command the Indo-Pac Command. The Obama administration, titled its Asia policy first the pivot, then the pivot became the rebalancing. The three sort of pillars of it were military strategy, an economic and trade strategy, and a showing up for regional meetings commitment. What's new? What's different? How would you characterize how are you defining the Indo-Pacific strategy today?
Great. Thank you, Ray. And it's really wonderful to be here with everybody today. When you look at the evolution of how we got to the Indo-Pacific, and let me tell you that it's still evolving, but people say, what's different from the rebalance? Well, Indo-Pacific, the rebalance was then, Indo-Pacific is now. Because what's happened is some things have changed on the ground. One thing is enlarged trade and foreign direct investment with the region. We're now at about $1.4 trillion worth of trade, two-way, between the Indo-Pacific countries and the United States. The United States has over $860 billion in FDI in the region. This is clearly an area where we've got a lot of economics, a lot of trade going on. It's expanding rapidly. I should also note that one of the big changes is the rise of India and the Indian Ocean area. And you referred to the Indo-PACOM, but we have the Indo-Pacific to really recognize what's happened in that region. And India's rise, India's ever-enlarging economy, India's interest in playing a larger regional role expands our outlook from something like just an East Asian Pacific region to including the Indian Ocean. I should note it's Indo-Pacific, not India-Pacific, because it also does include those other countries that are in the Indian Ocean region going over to the west coast of India. So it is all that area, seeing it as linked, connected to the Pacific region. So that's one of the big changes is the Indo-Pacific defines where we are today. And it's been an evolution. We've gotten bigger. It's gotten more important as a region. And the Trump administration now is we have this label on it to define that new important relationship.
Let's sort of get into some detail on some of the aspects. In terms of trade policy, economic policy, the centerpiece of the rebalancing was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Donald Trump took care of in his second or third day in office. And this administration seems to have a strong allergy to multilateral trade agreements. So what's the focus going to be in terms of trade policy? Let me also ask you about infrastructure policies and so forth. Maybe you could also tell us, in response to the Belt and Road Initiative of China, for example, are we going to increase our support for the Asian Development Bank? How does that kind of figure into our strategy?
Okay, thanks. There are quite a few things there, so if I miss one when I go back, feel free to remind me. let me take the going back forward. There is an infrastructure investment deficit in the region. I think the Asia Development Bank recently cited the figure of $1.7 trillion worth of investment that the region needs in infrastructure. There's about $50 trillion worth of money floating around in the world, private equity, other cash investments that are out there. And one of the most important things to do is to attract more of that money into the region. It's why we need rules that will attract that. If you look at the average public sector-led investment, in a developed world, for every dollar that the public sector puts in, there's usually about $2 worth of private money that comes in. In the Indo Pacific region, it doesn't work that way. For every dollar, you get about 30 cents. So what we have to do is make the region more attractive for investment because it's the private sector that will drive that. And so therefore, that's why we talk so much about rules-based order, so that there's coherence, that more of that private money can come in, because that's the only place you'll really have a change in infrastructure development. The government-funded money cannot do it alone. You mentioned Belt and Road. We don't really care where that money comes from. Country of origin, not important. What is important is the way it goes into a country. And what's very important is to have an open, transparent purpose that really fits the needs of that country, that expresses itself broadly, where analysis is done, is this what is needed? I refer you to the New York Times article even we saw today about what's happened in Sri Lanka, and they've gotten themselves into quite a debt trap. And I think that article is pretty illustrative of what happens if you don't have the right sort of investment. And so the key is not the origin of money, but how it goes in, what the plans are, what the trajectory is to make sure the money is spent correctly. Your first point was?
Trade.
Trade. The administration pulled out of TPP, and let's not put the strategic cart before the economic horse. And that is that there was, as the Donald Trump's election showed, there was real concern out there among American workers and American businesses about what was going on with trade. And until we have that part of the equation fixed, we can't go to a larger strategic piece of these big, broad trade agreements. So the president has stopped the TPP so he can look at what are the conditions of trade and basically to make it open, but fair and reciprocal. Free, fair, and reciprocal. The point is to make sure that the American workers and American businesses support our trade agreements. Once you have that, once those guys are taken care of, then you can go to something larger. But right now there's a sense that among those workers and among those businesses that, whoa, let's slow down a little bit, let's look at how we take care of ourselves, and we need that base before we can go into other trade agreements. So the trade policy is the president is looking at bilateral agreements, and as we speak now, more things are unfolding. I don't want to get too far ahead. U.S. Trade Representative's Office, Department of Commerce is working very much with the White House to lay out those strategies. But what we do know is the important thing is to make sure American workers and American businesses are satisfied with trade arrangements before we go entering into other arrangements.
I'm confident the audience will come back with good questions on the trade issue. So a lot of rumbling on the American business side this morning. Let's look at defense issues. One big part of the rebalancing was the shifting of a lot of our forces back from the Middle East, in many cases simply returning to the Asian theater after they'd been deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq. But the goal was to have 2/3 of our naval forces in the Pacific. I think we're probably reached that already by the end of the Obama administration. But
I think 2020 was the target for that.
2020. Okay. So I mean, does the Trump administration's strategy in terms of strategic deployments and military deployments, does it go beyond that? Are there new ideas?
One of the new ideas was, as we saw in the recent budget agreement, is that we needed to fund the military more. That a lot of it, they were very heavily deployed, and they didn't have the resources they needed to maintain that. And so the administration, the president was very concerned to get more money into the administration so that its military operations and defense operations could work a little bit better. And so we saw that, we saw the plus up, the military would be absorbing that, and a lot of it is just even paying for some of the operation costs that had been reduced to maintain our presence. So we see the president systematically looking at what we can do to make sure that when forces are moved into the region, they have all the training, they have all the rotational schedules that are proper to that level of force.
Yeah, and on the third pillar of what had been the rebalancing, showing up for regional meetings, being more involved, I guess this administration has a pretty good record so far. I can't think of a major summit that's been missed, so, a regional summit. So.
I think it's an outstanding record. The one thing, the centerpiece obviously was the president's 13-day visit to the region, both Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. We haven't seen that in a generation, a trip that long. But there are all these other things. As you remember, Vice President Pence came out to the region very shortly after he was in office. We saw Secretary Tillerson come out, Secretary Mattis come out. We've now seen Secretary Pompeo come out, a lot of other officials, a lot of other secretaries. If there's one thing this administration is, it's engaged with this region. Two of the issues that are very front and center in Washington, North Korea and trade, very much involve this region. And we just saw the president actually in Singapore, once again showing his commitment to working on Asian issues. So I think if there's one area that's getting almost more than its fair share of attention, it's the East Asia Pacific, the Indo Pacific.
So I know from recent conferences I've been at with our friends from Beijing that there is a fair amount of skepticism, sort of concern that an Indo-Pac strategy is somehow directed against China, that there's references to the Quad also seem to be sort of repackaging of old Japanese ideas, at least that's the way it's seen by Beijing. And how would you respond to that kind of concern?
The Indo-Pacific is for everybody. It's to set rules and regulations that that everybody can live with. It's to be a free and open Indo-Pacific. It doesn't exclude anybody. But what we do need is to have well-established rules about how things are going to operate here. Since the wars and all died down in about 1980 in the region, what we've seen is an unprecedented growth in peace and prosperity. Why jeopardize that? There's a system that works, and that's to have rules-based system. And it leads to all that infrastructure development. It leads to future peace and prosperity. The important thing is maintain that going forward. It's not aimed at any one country. Rather, it's inclusive. It wants every country to play by the same rules, so the small countries, the big countries are all the same under the strategy. And that's the goal of Indo-Pacific.
Secretary Mattis, others in the administration have expressed concern about China's policies in the South China Sea, about the military construction. After a pause at the beginning of the Trump administration, the challenges, I'm forgetting the term of art. The sailings, through past the islands. Yes, freedom of navigation. How could I forget FONOPS? Yes, freedom of navigation sailings were finally resumed, and actually, in some ways, were more pointed in the way they were structured than they had been during the Obama administration. What's the thinking about where we're going with that? I mean, frankly, the Chinese don't. Our challenges don't seem to have really stopped them.
Yeah. President Xi Jinping said in 2015 that there will not be a militarization of these features that they're building in the South China Sea. The other day we saw on Chinese television they showed a bomber landing on one of these features. Not helpful. So we saw Secretary Pompeo just a couple of weeks speak about this, that against the militarization. Nobody feels that the region is stronger and more peaceful with that. So I think one of the challenges is to make all the countries of the region understand that militarization's not good, peace and security is, and peace and security is maintained by a rules-based order where everybody follows what international law says about it, what custom says, and what's basically brought us peace and security since the 1980s.
But to get back to freedom of navigation, sailings don't seem to have had much effect on Chinese behavior. Do we have any new ideas?
I don't think I'd say that, but I think what freedom of navigation operations do is they maintain the standard that these are international waters, that everybody has the right to sail through them, as they always have, and that we will maintain that. This administration has normalized FONOPS. These operations go off on a regular basis, and because we believe that that's what you do in international waters. You sail through them whenever you want.
Let's open it up to questions from the floor. Or maybe we'll take start out with 3 questions, and then see where we are.
Good morning. I'm Glenn Van Zutphen, based here in Singapore. Been here for about 14 years. Over, well, the many years I've been here, we get congressional delegations coming through quite often. We just had one in February, for example. Very high-level delegation, Republicans and Democrats. For years, the business community in this part of the world has been begging for Congress to listen to TPP and to get involved with TPP. For American businesses here, it is essential, and we've seen some blowback because of the administration pulling out. To be fair, of course, Hillary Clinton said she would pull out of it as well. Steve Okun, who is here today and will be on one of the panels, has been leading that effort for the American Chamber here. But over time, we've seen every time that the folks come through, they have very little understanding at the congressional level, the leaders of Congress, as to what TPP is and how it would work, despite the fact that it's been around for about 12 years now. So my question in the negotiation phase, my question to you is, as diplomats trying to figure out what the trade policy should be vis-a-vis what the White House wants, when does the government actually start listening to people in region who have good ideas, who know what it's like on the ground, and who know what they need to succeed for American businesses?
Yeah, let's take a couple more. Are there? Yeah.
Good morning. I'm from Vietnam, where there's certain skepticism about the U.S. commitments in the region, particularly when it comes to the South China Sea, for example. In fact, there's the impact, as Ambassador mentioned, little reaction on the ground, and we'll still see militarizations in the area. And I wonder what would be next. Do you have any other kind of measures, or apart from the freedom of navigation? But in fact, even we have that, it doesn't create any kind of real change on the ground. Thank you.
Okay. Third.
Yeah, it's Guy Taylor from Washington Times. I'm the national security editor, so I really focus on this from a security prism. Mr. Secretary, I just want you to clarify something, because it sounded like you said that a key point of State Department messaging to partners in the region is that more militarization is bad for the region. And yet, the sort of most visible face of American action in the region is these trilateral, bilateral joint military exercises. So can you reconcile those two things, or just clarify it a bit? Thank you.
Want to go with those? Okay,
let's start with those 3. First of all, the one on TPP, I think there is a fair amount of information out there, but I think also that everybody looks at how does it affect us domestically. We've heard what's important out here, but right now the workers of Business of America, we need their support when we go into trade agreements, because if you don't have that support, ultimately will undermine those agreements. So right now that's where the focus is, making sure that those voices are heard and understand as we go forth and negotiate trade agreements. But as you said, CODELs come out here, staff DELs, the staffers there, I'm sure they get to hear whatever's out here, but they're making up their own minds about this based on what they're hearing from their constituents as well. On the gentleman from Vietnam, what's next? What's in addition to what we're having? Well, I think the Indo Pacific does lay out a framework that it will sort of show here's how we should operate, and that the important thing is for all countries to come into that understanding. And yes, the FONOPs are something, they're important, they continue, but I think what's most important is all the countries of the region are unified in the need, in their desire for a rules-based system that all countries in the region play in. And so that's why, as we go forward with the Indo-Pacific, you're going to hear more about it, and you're going to have President Trump saying more about it. You're going to have Secretary Pompeo, but that's coming in the future. But the important thing is to make this more operative in the region, and that really requires the support from all countries. It is inclusive, all countries. The face of the military in the region, certainly we have that. But I would note that when we just spoke earlier about all these high-level visits that have come out, most of those aren't just Secretary Mattis. Those are all through the administration, starting with the President, Vice President, going down to a lot of cabinet officers. There's a lot of civilian face out here, too. It's not just military. Military exists? Of course it does. But I have to say, as we go around, we have our embassies that do their work. In some countries, we have USAID. Some countries, there's Peace Corps. There are a lot of faces of America out in the region. It's not just a bunch of aircraft carriers moving around. And you put it all together, and the sum is that there's a large American presence out here. It's not going away. In fact, it's probably growing. And we're going to be here for a long time. We're a Pacific power, Pacific country. We have an awful lot of Americans who can trace their heritage to this region. We're involved, we'll continue to be involved across a broad spectrum of our society, our government, and all, maintaining that involvement.
Before asking for some more questions, let me just bore in on a couple of the points from the previous ones. Sure. Where is the interest in bilateral trade negotiation? I mean, is Japan interested? Is South Korea? I mean, well, South Korea already have an agreement, which we just renegotiated. But Japan, Taiwan, ASEAN countries, President Trump's made it clear that a bilateral agreement is going to be one that has to be very, very clearly in our interest. And there doesn't seem to be great enthusiasm on the part of potential partners to get into those negotiations, or maybe it's just occurring behind the scenes. I don't know.
Well, let me say, this is kind of a funny thing, it sounds rather bureaucratic, but first of all, the U.S. Trade Representative's Office and Department of Commerce have the lead on those, so they are basically outlining the strategy with the White House about how we're going to go forward on that. So I would, in some ways, we defer to them to take the lead in where that's going. So I've seen reports that you mentioned, Ray. I've seen those sort of things, but I'm not sure exactly how that's going to play out. But they're certainly engaging with countries on a broad range of issues, but I can't say what's coming next or where they're going.
And also, when are we going to? Can you say when we're going to hear? It's been a year and a half now, and we really have not had a clear public articulation of the administration's Asia policy. When can we expect to hear that from, a speech from the President, a speech from the Secretary of State, briefings of our allies and partners? What's the potential schedule for that happening?
Well, I think we already did hear from the President. He gave two speeches when he made his trip in November. One was in Seoul, and then one was in Da Nang. And I think in those two speeches, he outlined his vision for how we interact with the region. So I think there's an awful lot there already. And I know back in Washington, we really use those as our guides as we go put policies together and decide where to spend money. So I think he has articulated a policy, and those two speeches were widely distributed in the government before. We all knew that they were coming. We were able to participate in a certain extent. So I think we do have our policy here. But there's more coming with the Indo-Pacific. We haven't had the full-up Indo-Pacific speech that lays out everything, but that will be coming.
Okay. Let's open up for maybe 3 more questions.
Hi, my name is Momoko Kidera. I'm from Japanese newspaper Nikkei. Deputy Assistant Secretary, in order for the United States to promote law and order in the region that you spoke of, it seems better for U.S. to ratify the UNCLOS, United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea. But well, I don't see any momentum of the country to join the pact. How would you explain that?
Yeah, good morning. I'm Linda from the Philippines, ABS-CBN. The point was made earlier that there is a perception that the U.S. Seems to be losing the Philippines, and there might be some basis to believe that because of the very public display of affection from the Philippine leader towards the Chinese leader, and of course China coming in, bearing gifts, probably some of them Trojan horses, but. Does the U.S. feel this way, and if so, is the U.S. thinking of something to counter such a pivot on the part of the Philippines?
Hi, Stephen Jedgetts from ABC News in Canberra. You voiced a bit of concern earlier about debt for equity swaps and somewhat predatory loan practices which have been undertaken by China, referring specifically to Sri Lanka. But can I ask about the Pacific as well? We've seen fairly substantial Chinese loans to a number of now highly leveraged Pacific nations. Do you have concerns that we may see similar debt to equity swaps in the Pacific? And what messages is the US trying to convey to Pacific countries about some of the risks that might be contained?
Okay.
Okay, we've got UNCLOS, we've got Duterte and his the Chinese Trojan horses, and we have, I assume that you mean Pacific Island countries you were referring to. Yeah, right.
Okay, UNCLOS is something that has been around for a while, but it hasn't gotten through Congress or through the Senate, where any treaty does have to go through. I'm not sure the exact status of it right now, but I don't think there's a major push underway to have it ratified. That said, we do believe when two nations sign on to it and there's a decision based on UNCLOS, that decision should be followed. It is international law for those two countries, and they should follow what they signed. You also reminded me something I forgot to mention, that was the president has hosted only two leaders at Mar-a-Lago. One was the Chinese president, but twice for the Japanese prime minister. And that's something that is really unique to our region, once again showing his tremendous interest in what goes on in this part of the world. The Philippines. We have a lot of very deep ties with the Philippines. And I think those ties, they'll always be there. I think the Philippines has a special place in the heart of a lot of Americans, and I think the same is true going the other way. So we have difficulties. Countries can have difficulties, but the fact is that there's a solid basis of friendship between the two countries, and that's something that's very important. And I think that's how we always will look at the Philippines. On the Pacific Islands, I think that, as I said earlier, it doesn't matter so much where money comes from or what country, but the conditions under which it is given or lent to a country. And I think that it's always important for any country that receives money from abroad that it is done in a certain open and transparent way, and that is really aimed towards what the needs are of that country. And so I think it behooves all leaders, and wherever they are, to be looking at anything that comes from a foreign donor or a foreign lender, and to make sure it really fits what the country's needs are.
Well, and before that, just to follow up on the last one, I mean, a number of meetings I've been at recently, there seems to be a certain amount of concern, particularly on the part of some of our Asian partners and allies, about much more Chinese focus on the Pacific Islands in the last few years, and on sort of efforts to develop even security relationships or security presence in some of them. Sort of concerned about the U.S. not keeping up to date some of its compact renegotiations or with some of the Pacific Island countries. Is this an issue that has reached the level of focus in the administration?
Yeah, I think it has. We just put the Palau Compact was just funded the other day, so there is money moving in that direction that had been negotiated. Agreements had been negotiated earlier, and I think as we look elsewhere, we do get together with the Australians and New Zealanders as outsiders, looking at the region in the Pacific Islands, noting what's going on and trying to understand and speaking with them about what's best for their needs. And so I think that there is a lot of interest in what goes on. And more attention is being paid, and it's something that will continue.
Time for one more,
Yes.
two more?
Just
Okay.
one.
There's somebody, we'll take two.
Right. Okay. I'm Gulashada from Southeast Asian Press Alliance. Mr. Walter, you talk a lot about the Indo Pacific policies, especially the fact that the U.S. interest is to make sure that the level playing fields in that part is fair, opened. If you take that and compare to what you have done with the policies in the Asia Pacific, especially in Southeast Asia, where there is a huge concern of China influence overextended and its implication, human rights condition in this part of the region. I was wondering what has been done in this particular issue, especially you see that there is really a concern for this part of the region about the eroding or deterioration of the press freedom condition in Southeast Asia. Take, for example, Cambodia and Laos, where the China influence has been very strong, and it's really helped embolden the regime there to become confident in whatever they do with the citizens in terms of suppressing their rights to freedom of expression. Has there been any, perhaps, diplomatic efforts, to try to talk or to look into that issue with the government of Laos and Cambodia?
Morning, I'm Bhagya from the Straits Times. The post of the U.S. ambassador here in Singapore has been lying vacant for quite some time now. I'm wondering if Mr. Pompeo is looking to fill it up soon.
Empty seats, yes.
I've been asked that a lot. The White House will make a decision. The ambassador is the president's personal representative, and the White House will make an announcement when it chooses to. So we'll just have to wait for that on the announcement for an ambassador to Singapore. On press freedom, I think there's a larger issue of various rights and human rights that come out with that. And I'd like to mention that the United States sponsors very public reports on human rights, religious freedom, trafficking in persons. We go in, we deeply look at countries. Every embassy provides reporting back to an office in Washington that draws up these reports. We take very seriously. We seriously evaluate them. We actually rate countries in a lot of these areas. And we don't let that issue go away. And so I think, as someone who's been in many countries, when we release those reports and see the reaction from some of the host governments, we know they have an effect. In addition to that, on a regular basis, we speak with governments when we perceive human rights violations. Sometimes we speak very publicly about it. Sometimes we speak privately. It's usually a mixture of both, but I think we do a lot. I should also note that around the world, we often, May 5th, I guess, is the Press Freedom Day, World Press Freedom Day. We work with the Committee to Protect Journalists and other organizations to speak about press freedom, and we generally will host them and try to give them platforms to speak. And I would notice that there are some American officials at this very conference here because we very much believe in press freedom and the right to speak out.
Thank you. I think we've come to the end, but thank you very much. Thank you, Walter.